Good morning, YouTube. Warbles on a lot here. Sunday, the 12th of March 2015. Just getting ready for the Outsiders. First Moondog will be a separate broadcast as usual these days.
Time now for Outsiders. I'm Barry Cassidy, and you're not.
Much obliged, Uncle Barry. It is time for our Outsiders to join in chat today. I'm joined by Tim Lyons, former ACTU Assistant Secretary, Chris Berg from the Institute of Public Affairs, and Fiona Jenkins, convener of the ANU Gender Institute, senior lecturer in the School of Philosophy at the ANU. Tax. We're going to talk tax. Now, the Senate committee has been active in this past week. It's hauled some big corporate names into the spotlight for lively conversation on tax and its avoidance. The PM weighed in.
I think there are quite legitimate concerns that some companies, particularly multinational companies, through the device of transfer pricing, are minimising their tax in jurisdictions such as Australia.
And with news that the likes of Apple made $6 billion in this country in the past year while paying $80 million in tax, the Treasurer made a contribution too, and a promise.
We are absolutely determined to do whatever we can, as soon as we can, to ensure that people pay the tax that they should pay in the jurisdiction where they earn that income.
Now, the opposition was critical. Here's Chris Bowen.
What we're seeing from the government is policy on the run. Speculation about a Google tax or a diverted profit tax, which Labor considered, looked at the pros and cons and rejected because it breaches international tax agreements and for other reasons.
We'll talk about that Google tax in a moment, but Chris Berg, what are we seeing there in that past year? A star chamber or a reasonable pursuit of money that should be ours?
This is a massive beat up. The first thing to note is that there's no suggestion that these companies aren't paying the money they legally have to pay. So we hear a lot of words thrown around, even by the Treasurer and even by the Prime Minister, describing them as thieves or not paying the sort of money that they're supposed to pay. Well, there's no suggestion, as far as we can tell, that there is any unlawful tax evasion. What we are talking about is tax minimization, what people call tax avoidance, which is what you and I do every time we fill out our tax return and we deduct things that we used for work. Tax avoidance is entirely legitimate.
It may not be illegal, Fiona Jenkins, but is it moral?
Well, I think it's interesting questions about casting this as a purely moral problem. We like to talk about paying in the jurisdiction where the money is earned, but there's a lot of questions about where the money actually is earned, I think, when you're dealing with transnational companies. So, take the sort of classic case of your iPhone, where the components are made, who knows where, it's assembled in China, it's designed in California, it's sold here. What does that mean for, where's the money being earned? And I think that's, one of the huge complexities that we're dealing with when you talk about virtual space. Google, where's Google earning its money? Where is it? So I think, certainly it's a very important debate, but the question of, who's earning the money exactly where? It's very complicated.
Is that the thing in this too, Tim Lyons, that yes, we're seeing a discussion here about tax, but what we're also seeing is a discussion about a little country, us, flailing around, trying to extract something from vast multinational corporations that own no particular national allegiance. It's really testing the limits of our sort of national authority.
Yeah, I think it is in one way, Jonathan. One of the curious things about tax is the international agreements around tax are really a product of a series of decisions that were made, in fact, through League of Nations processes, and the world has
right on top of the internet fact.
Yes, and the world has kind of moved on a lot, and it's moved on in a number of ways that has made this more complex. The first is that digital is important, but there's still a lot of trade in stuff, actually, like physical goods, and even that's become more difficult. The global merchandise trade was, I think, 10% of global GDP in 1960. It's 25% now, which is the story of China, essentially, and the rise that Fiona talked about. But beyond that, we've had this question of digital production. We've had the question of the financialisation of all sorts of companies, including ones that make physical stuff, where the incredibly complex financial engineering that goes in behind the structure of corporations and the structure of transactions has made it very difficult for national governments to actually stay on top of that. And of course, you do have, and we've got a philosopher here, an almost ontological question, which is, does digital production have a physical locus such that you can tax it? And the old system was based around, in essence, you make a box of cutlery in Sheffield, you put it on a ship, it comes to Australia, it's sold at Myer Emporium. And I think you do see finance ministers globally flailing around about this. But I don't agree with Chris that it's a furphy, because in the last sort of really since before the G20 meeting, you've had political leaders across the G20, Obama, Merkel, Cameron before he got called in and beaten up by his mates from the City of London. Wayne Swan used to talk about it, Hockey talks about it. You've got people from across the political spectrum saying the ability of corporations to move money around and not pay tax anywhere is really the issue.
Let me jump in there, because they end up paying tax eventually. So the corporate tax is actually a really, really bad tax. And the reason it's a bad tax is because corporations never pay tax. People pay tax. Now, the corporation's tax has to be paid eventually by some humans. The evidence suggests that in the short run, it's paid by the investors in the firm, so shareholders. And in the long run, it's paid by a combination of shareholders and workers, the employees of the firms and the downstream firms. Eventually, someone has to pay these taxes. So what we're seeing is not that these companies aren't being taxed, but the shareholders of the taxes are eventually being taxed on the income from their shares in the countries in which they reside. Corporations tax is a very, very complicated tax. And one of the reasons that governments like it is because it's not obvious who pays it. We can say, oh yeah, well, these big multinational, big businesses, they're paying the tax, not just us people, not the people who have superannuation accounts or so forth. But eventually, people have to pay tax. Corporations don't pay anything.
You convinced by that, Fiona? I mean, we want our states, our governments to do stuff. We want them, therefore, to raise the revenue to make that possible. Is this just a deflection of our personal responsibility into that process?
Well, as I understand it, tax gets paid on profits, right? So that at some level, we're talking about shareholders being taxed at some level. So, I mean, I think that's an important dimension. But I do think it's really important to see this in the wider sort of political economy that is happening, and whereby, sure, it's going to matter that, the people who are making the profits are keen to live in a place like Australia, if that's where we're going to, want to draw the revenues to. It's going to be, a significant part about what kind of society we are. And in a sense, that's where I think some of the moral questions might come back in. It's kind of, well, how do we be the kind of society that people, really want to live in? And clearly that's one of the reasons that Australia does draw people to come, and locate their transnational companies here. It's a moral issue about what kind of decent society fosters a place where people want to be.
Well, and more broadly, Tim Lyons, we're having that conversation in this country too, around our tax base, around our sense of aspiration as a country. It's sort of interesting that in the midst of all the complexities of that, and there's a conversation we're having with some intensity politically at the moment, that we get lost in this sort of populist attack on the evil multinationals. It's in a way a bit of a distraction from what could be the core of that conversation.
I think it's a bit of a symptom, Jonathan. I think most ordinary punters who are sitting around thinking about the tax system, or hearing the reports of the last week, or seeing some of the footage of the Senate inquiry, it speaks to a creeping sense they've got that the tax system is a bit of a game and they don't know the rules. And it's a game that other people get to play, and that game is played by wealthy people who are able to structure their affairs by companies and family trusts and other things that mean they don't pay tax. And most of us still, about 11 million working Australians still are in the PAYE system, and short of a couple of deductions for giving some money to some binnies and I bought a new bag to carry my papers to the office, there aren't a lot of deductions.
That's a good point, isn't it, Chris?
That sense, I think, really underpins why when they hear of it, when ordinary people hear about these kind of arrangements, they, it gets the blood up.
And that's, Chris, you say that, the taxes, this is the way everybody plays this game. I mean, that isn't true, as Tim says, for the majority of people who simply have it taken out of their pay, who don't really make many great manipulations when they file their returns. And that's the vast majority of people. Yes, as Tim suggests, that's the resonance of this. It's
Yeah,
the
no,
unfairness.
and that's absolutely right. Which is why we've seen we've seen some popular opinion stuff about this. But they're not the large corporations aren't the only players of this game as well. The political class are playing and designing the rules of this game. And as I say, one of the reasons they have chosen to rely on company tax and these sorts of incredibly complicated taxes, where the incidence, the final burden, is held by someone that it isn't
Chris,
initially.
you've said that already today, and I mean, you know, tax incidence is a complicated thing, and there's no doubt that some corporate income tax is paid by labour. It's paid out of what might otherwise be higher wages in the economy. But particularly in an Australian context, a lot of corporate tax actually falls on economic rents. It falls on, not on labour, but on the shareholders via things, because most of our corporate income tax is actually paid by companies that are the miners and the banks. It's our corporate income tax is a de facto mining super profits tax in effect, and it taxes the oligopoly profits that our banks make, which are enormous, and it taxes a few other highly profitable companies in the limited markets in Australia, like Wesfarmers and Woolworths. And so, you know, it's not true to say that we can just give up CIT, or CIT is not a good tax. It's important, particularly in the context of the structure of the Australian economy.
There's a few things I could pick up to dispute, but the major thing that we all have to remember is that we are all investors, we are all shareholders, and deliberately so through the superannuation system.
Yeah, and most people's stake in BHP, they got a much bigger stake, the average Australian, in having BHP pay its tax properly than the return on the tiny parcel of shares they'd have by their super.
You're listening to Outsiders here on Sunday Extra. Tim Lyons, former ACTU Assistant Secretary, Chris Berg from the Institute of Public Affairs, and Fiona Jenkins, convener of the ANU Gender Institute. Now, this was another thing, not on the subject of tax, that the PM had to say last week.
Any other government, I suspect, would quickly succumb to the cries of the human rights lawyers and others, and what that would mean very quickly is that the people smugglers would be back in business, the boats would start again, and the drownings would start again. And I'm determined to make sure that that doesn't happen. Full stop.
Fiona Jenkins, the PM made those comments in the context of the knowledge now that we have that sexual abuse and other abuse of children had been taking place in Nauru for at least 17 months before the most recent inquiry. Is it time to pander to the bleatings of the human rights lawyers?
It's the most extraordinary deflection of the problem, isn't it, onto the bleating human rights lawyers who are saying that what Australia is doing is illegal. I think, you know, that particular set of statements was just so revealing of an attitude where you're going to dismiss really aspects of the rule of law that has to do with how we, you know, take seriously what human rights lawyers and international law have to say.
Why are we brushing this under the carpet, Chris Berg? I mean, how do we do the gum and walk trick of deterring people smugglers and having some sort of basic humanity to people who are being abused in our name?
I don't think there's anything in what he said that changes materially the discussion about what has been happening with asylum seekers with asylum seeker policy for the last couple of years. The distinction that he's making now is just being more overt about it, talking about, so he's not selling the story in one way, he's selling the story in a different way. But when it comes down to it, he's selling the exact same narrative, which is that we have a deterrent strategy and we're not going to be pushed away from that. He just wants to hand the blame over to Labor, who wouldn't be as strong as.
Is that a confession of the strategy, Tim Lyons? That we're trying to be cruel?
Yeah, well, I think it is, and maybe it's a good thing in the end that the inherent cruelty of some of these policies is actually openly admitted, as opposed to dodged, which I think it probably has been over a period of years. I actually think it's a bit of a sign of weakness in some senses, where you get a Prime Minister decide to say, I will stand up to somebody who essentially has no power. And what's the power of a human rights law? And they run off and file a writ. I think the more interesting story last week about the detention centre environment was the...
Sadly, I have to end this broadcast here. I'll be back with the second half or the final ending and then First Dog on the Moon.